I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to host you here at Newburgh. I think about the history of this conference. Chicago, New York, and Newburgh, Oregon. One of these cities is not as strong in the foodie culture I'm feeling among the three. I am the dean of the seminary. I'm also a biblical studies professor specializing in Old Testament language and literature. I want to share a little bit about how my theology informs the way that I run the seminary. Specifically, I'm in the middle of about 10 years of research on the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah is a bit of a bizarre book in terms of inclusion. So I want to talk a little bit about some surprising things in the theology of Ezra and Nehemiah that helps us think about the way the church is and will be, and the way that we are to approach the church in leadership. And so Ezra and Nehemiah, for many, is very problematic. A lot of people think the text is actually very exclusive, and for good reason. The book centers on building a wall. Literally in Nehemiah 2, it says, "Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem." And this is the center part of the narrative. Now, Jerusalem was a major city, but it wasn't a huge city because it doesn't sit on the north-south corridor of any of the major trade routes. It's somewhat isolated. It has a decent hinterland for agricultural production, but not a great one. So it's a good-sized city, but not a huge city. There are certainly bigger cities in ancient Israel. But it was the holy city of God. It was the one chosen by the Lord. It was the place that the Lord chooses. And by building a wall, they're making a statement not just for protection against banditry and invaders, but a statement on who's in and who's outside. And that is subject to very good and bad interpretation, how are we to think about a wall in Jerusalem. Also in Ezra and Nehemiah, there is the final chapter, and I have one verse, "Thus I cleanse them from everything foreign." You may remember that Nehemiah begins to freak out when Judeans are marrying non-Judeans. And Ezra is quite the drama scribe, and he tears out his hair, tears down his clothes, he mourns before God. He talks literally about the defilement of the holy seed because of these mixed marriages. He also talks about children. Nehemiah talks about children. Some of them speak Hebrew, some of them speak Ashdodite, and this is a problem. So what did they do? They actually banned the foreign wives and the children from these marriages from the people. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah has been interpreted in the Christian tradition in very hurtful ways in the past and in the present. You may have heard a news story from earlier this year. There was a local government official, and this is what he said, quote, "I'm a Christian, and my Christian beliefs are that you don't do interracial marriage. That's the way I was brought up, and that's the way I believe." This politician goes on to say, "I have black friends. I hired black people. But when it comes to all this stuff you see on TV, when you see blacks and whites together, it makes my blood boil because that's just not the way a Christian is supposed to live," unquote. A small tip for public speakers. If you feel a need to preface a statement with, "I have black friends," you may need to rethink the words that are going to come out of your mouth. So how can I reconcile my own study of Ezra and Nehemiah with the work of inclusion, the sponsorship of diversity within the seminary setting? Ezra and Nehemiah, they do narrate the building of a wall. They narrate the breakup of mixed marriages, and they label such activity as defilement of the holy seed. It goes to a question, what is Ezra and Nehemiah really about? In these 10 years, what am I discovering? So a little story about my journey with Ezra and Nehemiah. So I published my first book in 2012. I had no intention of working on Ezra and Nehemiah. My first book is on 1st and 2nd Kings. In 2014, I went on a year-long sabbatical to Seoul, Korea, where I was a visiting professor. I had a project in mind when I wrote my sabbatical proposal, applied for funding, and I arrived in Seoul with my wife, who like me is ethnically Korean, our two sons, who are third-generation Korean Americans. And when approved for sabbatical, we made our plans. I arranged for this visiting professorship. And I remember talking to my mom to confirm to my mom that she had come to the States. She had immigrated in 1967, which indeed she did. So in 1964, they released the immigration quotas for East Asians, and from them, a ton of us came over. Our family came through an aunt who married a GI right after the Korean War, and they slowly, one by one, sponsored my dad's family to come to the States. So my mom and my dad came in 1967, and this is a picture of Seoul in 1967. They came to the States, and I remember my mom telling me she flew into San Francisco, where I was born, and she remembers seeing all these gigantic buildings and just being amazed at the skyscrapers of San Francisco. In 2014, I returned to Seoul with my own family, and this is a picture of Korea in 2014. And you can imagine the change from 1967 to 2014. Not only the change in Seoul, but change in me, in my family. How much change within us as ethnic Koreans living in the United States. This is significant because you would remember the Judeans were exiled in 586 BC, and they came back in 539 BC, 47 years. 1967 to 2014, 47 years. They came back with their third generation. And in reading Ezra and Nehemiah back in Korea as a repatriate, I began to appreciate the social setting of what it is like to come back to a country you're from but weren't born in, and to come back with your children who are third generation removed from that ethnic origin. And there's one story that was really very profound for me as I thought about that reality of a return migration. My younger son was 6 when we moved back, and my wife and I are kind of weird that he actually didn't speak English till he was 4. We were really paranoid. We wanted him to learn Korean. So we come back to Korea. He's 6. We get an apartment. In Korea, they have these small soccer fields in every apartment complex. And so our 6-year-old is playing with neighborhood Korean boys, and they're playing soccer, and his Korean language is clean at this time, and summers in Korea are massively hot and humid. He comes back, he's sweaty, playing with all these Korean boys, and as a 6-year-old, he asked me a question: "Dad, am I Korean or am I American?" So even as a 6-year-old, there's a certain consciousness that even though he looks Korean, he's not really the same as the rest of the boys. Am I Korean or am I American? I actually think the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is about immigrants and about their identity. And it's fronted with a very opening verse: "Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah." Cyrus, the foreign king and emperor, permits the Judeans to return to Jerusalem, and that's what they do. So essentially, Ezra and Nehemiah is about a group of immigrants, a very special group of immigrants who are returning back to their home country, but after 47 years. So like many immigrant groups, they are politically marginalized. You see that in the text, as they fight with neighbors, with Samaritans, as they struggle for legitimacy among the Persian government. They're also economically marginalized. We see that from Nehemiah 5, where there's so much taxation placed upon them. They're selling their lands, and they're selling their own children to debt slavery. It says in Nehemiah 5 that even the women, the daughters, are being devastated. And the Bible is very laconic. Whenever there's extra detail, the women being devastated, it means something terrible is happening specifically to the daughters being sold into slavery. So rather than looking at some of the exclusionary practices as a hermeneutical norm, I would like to argue that the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is about those in liminal spaces and God's care for them, those that do not have a direct home, those that are politically marginalized, those that are under economic pressure, and those that are seeking to find an identity amongst themselves as repatriates. Ezra and Nehemiah is a lot more inclusive than you think. Another example I'd like to point out is in Ezra 6:21. So remember, they built a wall. Remember, they ended the mixed marriages and forced out the foreign wives and the foreign children from that marriage. But look at Ezra 6:21. This happens right over after the celebration of the building of the temple, and they're about to celebrate the Passover. This is not a minor holiday in Jewish tradition. This is a big deal, the day of the Passover celebration. And here it says, the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by all who had joined them and separate themselves from pollutions of the nations of the land. It's a tiny little verse here, but it's so meaningful theologically. Because even though there was this talk about holy defilement through mixed marriages, even there was the construction of the wall, it turns out for the Passover celebration, the very first Passover after the completion of the temple, they're inviting people from all the nations. This is a real paradoxical theology. And I would like to argue that the identity is through worship and not ethnicity. It is in fact their relationship with God, which transcended their ethnic origin and invited them to invite others to celebrate not only the food, which is symbolic sustenance, but also those who will worship the Lord, the God of Israel, together. It is proper worship and not ethnicity, which is the real community that they are building. The Passover is accessible to everyone. Theologically, I don't want to minimize the challenges from the building of the wall, the mixed marriage. These are very problematic, but I think they need to be read in light of the greater context of Ezra and Nehemiah, a small group of immigrants coming back to Judah with their third-generation children, trying to forge their identity within the midst. As leaders in higher education, should we not take a lesson from this surprising case for inclusion, that we are to look after the marginalized and those in liminal spaces? As we steward something very powerful, education that leads to opportunity, financial growth, stability, that we should be thinking of those in the spaces that are the most liminal. I want to share with you a few efforts that Portland Seminary is doing to become more inclusive based on this theology of inclusion. This is not really a how-to for your institution. This is just really reflections on what's happened at the seminary the last 2 years in terms of our practices and our efforts towards inclusion. Because the church today and the future is becoming more and more diverse. I am not doing a good job as the dean of the seminary if I'm not helping our students prepare for the church of the future. This first picture is a picture of the 6 people, full-time people that we've hired at the seminary since I began. I believe that your hiring practices of the institution are the single greatest thing you can do to be more inclusive as institutions. You could do that. Make note. It is the single greatest thing you could do. So when I was a first-year professor in 2008, I was at a conference, and I heard someone from our accreditation board, the ATS, say to me something very profound, and I've held on to it ever since. He said that whatever your institution says are your values, the operative values are on display whenever you make a hire. Whatever you say, the practices of hiring say something about what you truly value as an institution. In the last year and a half, we have made 6 full-time hires at the seminary. None of these were backdoored by me. All of them followed a process. 5 of the 6 hires are women. 5 of the 6 are non-Western European and ethnic origin. 4 of the 6 speak English as a second language. And all 6 of them went through a regular procedure of hiring, of submitting application, interviewing from the very beginning to the very end. None of them were backdoored. All of them were consensus hires. I did not make a single decision with all 6 of these. I did not make an executive call. All 6 of these were consensus hires. I maintained a very strict process, and I trusted my team. And none of them were so-called minority hires. The PhDs of the professors are from the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt University, Boston University. These are brilliant. One of the hires was actually a co-writer of a grant that created the position. And I told her, you have to apply for this position, even though you helped get the money for this. You have to follow process. Now, as an evangelical seminary in the Northwest, we are 2/3 ethnically diverse as a full-time faculty. We are 1/3, thank you. I'm so proud of this. We are 1/3 ethnically diverse on the administrative side. I think the single greatest step that you can do is looking and examining your hiring protocols. And I know sometimes it's the Christian universities that are most complicit with unfair hiring practices. Sometimes I've heard people say the back door is the only door. Well, I would encourage you, whatever you are in your place of agency in your institution, to shut that back door, maintain process and procedure in hiring practices. And I can say with this 6, the seminary has been transformed since they started in the last 2 months. The conversations we have on the church, the conversations we have on training pastors, on congregations, on the future of ministry has been completely transformed with these 6 excellent hires. Another step, so hiring is the single most important thing you can do. Another step is through grants. So as Rebecca said, Portland Seminary has been very successful in getting grants in the last few years. Our first one, the picture on the bridge of a bunch of high school kids, in 2015 received $500,000 from the Lilly Endowment as part of the Youth Theology Initiative. And what we do, we run a high school theology camp. You've heard of like band camp and football camp and volleyball camp. This is a theology camp where we take 25 high school students and we teach them theology. And what's happened through grant money generally doesn't affect the budget. It's generally some sort of restricted fund. And with the goals of the grant, you're allowed to do and try things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So one of the values that we had is having diverse assemblage of high school students. So this last camp that we ran in July, and so I'm the dean, but for 1 week I just drive a van and go bowling. It's terrifying. This last camp that we ran, we had 40% diverse students. A lot of them were able to receive full scholarships, and we have almost 25% of the graduates of this camp come and enter George Fox University as undergraduates. 40%, which means we can hire diversely. We need to hire diversely for that as well. Another picture you see with the grass in front, we received in 2017 $1 million from the Lilly Endowment for the Institute for Pastoral Thriving. And we looked at what makes pastors thrive. We learned sometimes pastors need to be with their own. So we created cohorts. They're all 50% gender diverse and ethnically diverse. In addition to that, we created specialized cohorts. We're running one right now with all Korean-speaking pastors. We're starting one in May with all Latino pastors. We're going to do one with pastors that all serve the African Descent Church. We're also going to have a cohort of all women pastors. And these have been such rich conversations. And we can do this, we can decide because this is the grant money and this is the goal of the grant initiative from Lilly Endowment. And you don't need to find grants of $500,000 or $1 million to be successful in this endeavor. The other picture is actually a grant of $5,000. It's not that much in grant land. And what we did with this grant, we have brought in a lot of, in the past, George Fox has brought in all sorts of consultants on diversity, and they have mixed results. What we did with this grant, we wanted to try something different. I want to get volunteers. If you want to join us for the day, I will pay you. I'm going to feed you some Korean barbecue and some boba. And I'm going to take you amongst different Asian communities in Portland. We're going to a Korean immigrant church. We went to a Vietnamese church. We spoke with Taiwanese, Indian, and other Chinese descent pastors. And we had conversations of what ministry is like for Asians in the Portland area. This was only $5,000, but it was completely transformative because they didn't come to us, we went there. We received tours of the churches, we listened to pastors, and we asked each one, what is some of the strength your community brings to greater Christianity? The second question, what can we do to train pastors to be effective in a Vietnamese context or a Korean American context? And this was a completely paradigm shifting for a lot of my staff as they went on this, and we'll do the same thing with the Latino church and the African Descent church in the spring. Another thing that we did is seminary scholarships. And so a few years ago, a Caucasian couple started a new scholarship fund at the seminary, saying we want to prepare diverse leaders for the church. And so I have so many restricted scholarship accounts, but I decided to focus on this one in terms of raising money, because I know that so many pastors from certain ethnic groups, they just don't have the money to attend seminaries. And a lot of these immigrant churches, I grew up in an immigrant church, they don't have the funds to support seminarians. So this is the one scholarship I really focused on the fundraising for, the Diversity Leadership Scholarship. And I'm happy to say in the fall of 2019, the majority of ethnically diverse seminary students, I was able to double their scholarship amount just purely from this one scholarship fund. This is a very pragmatic difference for the church and for the seminary. Hiring practices, grants, scholarships, 3 very pragmatic ways that I can reflect on and how the seminary has been successful. Now, the road to diversity in diverse institutions is very long. I've been here since 2008. When I came, I was one of 7 diverse faculty full-time faculty at George Fox University. Now we have over 40. And so it's important for me to look back. We still have a lot of work to do as an institution, but I'm incredibly amazed at the great work some of my colleagues have been doing in diversifying our faculty and seeing the impact that it has. I encourage you to remember your identity of who you are. Back to that story with my younger son, who was 6 at the time. Dad, am I Korean or am I American? And whenever he would ask me a very serious question, I had the same routine. I would get down to his level and grab his hand, look him in the eye, and say to him, I don't know, ask your mom, which I did. And so we're in Korea, goes to his mom, my wife, and asked my wife, Mom, am I Korean or am I American? And my wife says, well, what do you think you are? And he says, I think I am both. I think I am Korean, I think I am American. We are Christians. We are universities. We are both. And I encourage you to take seriously the mandate that the image of God is in every single human on earth. Amen. That you are your brothers and your sisters' keeper. And that you are commanded by Jesus to love one another in the love that Christ models for us. And my prayers and my cheering is alongside you as together we fully embrace our identity as Christians and servants of the university. Thank you.